Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Tank Mechanic Simulator video. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today we are jumping into the grease pit with the KV-1. Going to show you a little bit of the restoration of this KV-1 in-game. This is actually a captured KV-1 I'm working on. I'm going to make it a captured version, which I'll explain here in a little bit. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the KV-1 series. KV-1 tank series is a series of heavy assault tanks. This series was named after, and I'll probably screw this up, Kilmet von Schlevov. I know I mispronounced it. It's Russian. I have a lot of problems pronouncing some Russian stuff. Kilmet was a defense commissar and politician that served with the Red Army during World War II. The series of the KV series were noted for their heavy armor protection during the early stages of the war. In fact, the KV-1 was basically immune to the 3.7 centimeter KWK-36 main gun mounted on the Panzer III and the short-barreled 7.5 centimeter KWK-37 mounted on the Panzer IV and the Stug 3. This is the short-barreled howitzer version of those guns, which is more of a support cannon to fire high explosive than armor-piercing munitions. In certain situations, and there is actual historical documentation of this, a KV-1 or KV-2 with proper infantry support could halt a large German advance during the early stages of the war. At the time, the German Wehrmacht only had the 8.8 centimeter flat gun to deal with the KV series of tanks until more effective guns could be developed, as well as more effective tanks. The Tiger tank would be one of those tanks, as well as the Panther. And then, of course, the long-barreled 75 millimeter main guns was mostly produced to deal with the T-34 tanks and KV-1s. Prior to the start of Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, the Soviet Army would have only around 500 KV-1 tanks in service. As the war progressed, it became more evident that there was little sense to continue to produce KV-1 tanks, as in general the T-34 performed equal or better than the KV-1. The KV-1 was developed based on lessons learned from the failures of the T-35 multi-turret tank. However, it seems that the Soviet Army was married to the idea of a heavy breakthrough tank with thick armor and very heavy firepower. The T-35 was complex to produce and expensive, and it was also hard to maintain and considered vulnerable. It also suffered from poor mobility, and its armor protection was considered insufficient. After the Spanish Civil War, many new tanks would be put on the drawing boards. The SMK would be one of these tanks. It would feature two turrets, one large turret with a 76.2 millimeter main gun, and a smaller turret with a 45 millimeter main gun. It would have heavier armor, wide tracks, and a torsion bar suspension made a mix of casting and welds. Another version of the SMK would only have the one main large turret with a 76 millimeter main gun. This tank would later become known as the KV tank. The Soviets would enter the Winter War with Finland, and they would enter the war with the SMK, the KV tank, and the T-100. The KV-1, it wasn't the KV-1 yet, it was still known as the KV, proved to be superior to all the other two tanks, which would be the SMK and the T-100, and seemed to be well liked. 50 more KVs would be produced. The Soviets found it difficult to deal with the Finnish bunkers, so a new KV-2 with a large slab side turret and a 152 millimeter howitzer would also be produced. At first, the two different tanks were known as the small turret KV, this would be the KV-1, and the large turret KV, this would be the KV-2. Other KV variants produced would go over through a series of upgrades. One of the first variants was the KV-1B, where it would feature a plate of applique armor on the front upper glacis. That can actually be seen here in game. The next variant was the KV-1S. This version was made with thinner armor and a smaller cast turret. This was designed to increase the speed of the KV-1. Finally, another KV-1 I'm going to talk about in particular. I actually wrote an article about this KV-1 a few years ago now. Is known as the Panzerkampfwagen 756R. Take note of how it looks there, especially the main gun, the turret, and the turret modifications. You can actually see the commander's cupola there as well. And I want to dive into more about this specific variant in a little bit. This was actually a KV-1B variant, and typically, to understand things, most German captured KV tanks would be repainted and remarked. But this version would be extensively remodified. All the MGs were replaced with MG34s. A hole was cut in the roof of the turret, and a Panzer IV type cupola would be added to the turret. Radios would be replaced as well with more advanced German radios. The F-34 76.2 millimeter main gun that was mounted in the KV-2 would be replaced with a 7.5 centimeter KWK-40 L-43 main gun. After modifications, they actually had to cut a hole in the gun mantlet for the new KWK-40. However, only one Panzerkampfwagen 756R would be produced, and it was in service with the 22nd Panzer Division, 204th Panzer Regiment in 1943. So that's really all I'm going to talk about with the KV-1, although there is one little tidbit of information here I want to cover that I didn't cover in the notes, and that is actually about the KV-2. So to understand some things, when the Russians designed the KV-2 onto the KV-1 chassis, they didn't change the bearing race at all. They essentially just designed a new turret to fit in the old, into the hull. And because they made no modifications to the bearing race, the turret was actually very hard to traverse. It was a hand crank turret. The other problem that gave is because of how heavy the turret was and its very high sides. If you were on a slope, based on how much the slope was, you would not actually be able to traverse the turret at all. And if the slope was too great, the turret would actually literally fall off the tank. Yeah, that's a bit of a problem. Also, because of all this, the engine was not upgraded for the KV-2, and the increased weight actually put a lot of stress on the transmission and the engine. In such case, the vehicles of the KV-2 would actually have some transmission and engine problems that the KV-1A did not have. The KV-1A was actually considered, for its time, to be a very reliable tank. However, the KV2, on the other hand, was not so reliable and had a lot of design flaws to it. Anyway, folks, I'm going to shut my mouth now. I'm going to let this video continue just a little bit longer where you can see some firing and you can see some test driving of the vehicle. I will join you back in a little bit. So anyway, folks, that is the end of the video. Hopefully you learned something new about the KV-1 tank and possibly even the KV-2 tank that you did not already know. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and have yourself a wonderful week.